What I'm going to try to talk about is how Lake Forest Academy was 90 years old when it was first coming out here in 1948. So it was already 90 architects at the time working on the grounds and everything. So when they came here, it was natural. They actually got a good bargain. They bought something that was already done, so they didn't have to work with anyone. Oh, my feedback. I'm sorry. So to start out with an example right here. The plan of Lake Forest was on its scale the largest full-town scaled romantic suburb with curvilinear streets when it was done in 1857. It was registered 2 months before Frederick Law Olmsted. It looked like 2 entrances. The left was for faculty, right for students. And after it burned, they rebuilt it on the university campus to the south. And the building had really the same style and the same 2 entrances that were there. So they really just recreated what they'd had. The architect for the original building was Asher Carter of Carter and Drake, which was the main people right before the Chicago fire. This is by an associate of W.W. Boynton named Welch, who had a connection to Lake Forest Academy. He designed that building. And by 1893, they had competition from the eastern schools because railroad trains had improved so that you could make a through train. Before, you had to transfer 8 times to get from Chicago to New York. But by the 1890s, you could take a through train all the way to New York. And so people were sending their kids east, so the academy had to ramp up. This is Pond and Pond's wonderful main Reid Hall that was built in 1893. It was surrounded by like a hen and mother baby chicks around it with dormitories. But look at it was high quality interior, very nicely done. Nice chapel, lecture hall sort of thing, not shabby at all. Good campus, tennis courts. You can see this is a first class cottage on the right. There was a second class dormitory on the left. So that's a concept I don't think they do now. So they actually did have, just like on an ocean liner. Now in 1946, after the war, they were about to build a new gym. This is done by the teacher of architecture here at Grafton, who was Chester Walcott. And he designed that, but something intervened. The building burned to the ground. The main hall of the building just disappeared. It was up on the upper right, that's where it was. And so they sold this campus to Lake Forest College by 1948 and moved into the new Reid Hall, which was they got without having to deal with the architects, anything. They made a good deal in 1948 to buy this property. It was 4748 and moved here. And this is where they've been the core of the campus since. Now, it had been built from 1904 to 1910 by J. Ogden Armour. Now, Mr. Armour was a second-generation Chicagoan who was, his father was Philip Danforth Armour, a brilliant trader, inventor of refrigerator cars, which altered tremendously the flow of foods and everything like that. They took the cattle business and turned it into the meat business, quite a different thing. This is his mother. This is Philip D. Armour, who was alive. Philip D. Armour had died earlier, and she was part of the multi-generational family. Here's his daughter, Lolita, on the left, and his wife, Lolita Sheldon from Armour from Connecticut. And this is going to be their country place. The idea of a country residence goes clear back to classical times. Pliny the Younger described in one of his letters his place near the water near Rome, and this was this Laurentian villa, taking the words and putting it into a plan. In the Renaissance, this was all revived, and this is an Italian Renaissance thing from a 1904 book by Edith Wharton called Italian Villas and Their Gardens. And this hit right before this property was being acquired in late 1904. This shows the group. Here's the old streetscape over here on the right. That's Deer Path Road. It goes out. It goes clear out to Waukegan Road. And then the first building, whoops, down below, right here, that's the gate to the wandering trail that went clear over to the house. Now here's the map. This is kind of a stylized map of the layout. It was drawn to go curlicued around and then angled over the former bridge that was here to the house. The reason that landscape architects did that was so that the guys coming from their offices in Chicago, getting off the train, they needed to cool down a little bit. So they didn't get home and kick the dog and yell at the kids. So they would do, the landscape architects would plan it so they would wind through their place and kind of relax. That was the whole idea. Because otherwise, why would you have a mile-long drive to your house on your own property? Here it shows it a little bit more accurately. This is an early plan of what it actually looked like with the land parcels that put it together. There was a Martin Melody who had a farm, and his kids and everything had married around, and the daughters and all had other parcels of it. There was a problem they were running into, that there were these people that looked like English people riding horses, chasing a little fox, and they were running through their fields and wrecking their crops. So, you know, the people would say, well, what are you going to do? You can't run through our farms. And they'd say, well, how much do you want for your farm? So he accumulated 800 acres pretty quickly, eventually 1,000 acres. And this just shows the numbers of how he got that much money. But Martin Melody was the main one, and he was able to then move into the city, give up farming, and be very comfortable in town. This is the architect, the high society architect of the day, Arthur Hoyne, who had been doing all the Prairie Avenue houses at that time, and he was the top guy to get for being the architect. And he had control of the entire project, all the land, everything about the house would go through him. It was such a big project, 400 feet long, that they had to invent a new kind of steam shovel to dig the foundation. This is the steam shovel that they invented to be able to handle the scale of this house. At this time, J. Allen Armour was the second wealthiest American behind Rockefeller. This is just another picture from that 1904 book. The illustrations were by Maxfield Parrish, very romanticizing the idea of what it would be like to have, you know, water, woods, statuary, your house in the background. This is what the gardens looked like in the Renaissance in Europe. Lots of detail and spread out into different rooms. This is a photograph of the Villa Lante, and in more recent times, and you can see how that all works together. Notice the water that's prominent in the picture. This is a gate that's not here. This is the Breakers in Newport. Anybody been to the Breakers in Newport? This is the gate there. That was done in the 1890s, about a decade, roughly a decade before the house. And this is the same classical ideal. So when you look at the entrance gates off of Waukegan Road, you see the same aesthetic very much at work. Just a little detail to see, but it has classical mask there. It's got very nicely detailed classical features. Still there. It's now part of the open lands property over there, but students, I'm sure, go over there to see the open landscape. Originally, there was this big road. The landscape architect O.C. Simons, who was tops in Chicago, was also trained as an engineer. So this is a nice engineer-built hefty road, and it led to a very hefty bridge that they could go over the railroad tracks, because Armour wanted his house past all the railroad tracks in Lake Forest. No more rapid. And he built a wall then, you know, it's like the Wall of China. But you got to overpass there, you go by the lake, and you're heading over toward the house. These lakes, because this is sort of lowlands in here, some of this, it used to be unfashionably known as swamps, you know, and they drained these and fixed them up. And so it's very nice. This is a 1939 aerial shot of what it all looked like when the plantings were mature, and you can see the building there down below. So then you would drive up to the house, and look at how you have this nice driveway up to the entrance, and a pool right in the middle. Now the house was built, as I was saying, probably got finished toward 1908, and that sort of thing. They started moving in 1909. Electricity, though, didn't really hit Lake Forest until, and cars, to come out this far. Cars and that both hit in 1904. And so you only started to see fountains like this with water shooting up by 1904, 1905. So this would have been one of the earliest big fountains in Lake Forest. There's one extant from that period at Ragdale here in Lake Forest, much smaller, much more modest, but this is one of them. You had to have juice or you couldn't make the water. This shows the little drive-through dog trot that led away, and then so on the right was Giacomo's office, in the house where she could get out when it was raining or cold, like maybe today, and not have to be outside very much. The main entrance was, of course, a little bit farther over, and it had this nice, very classical entryway in with the sconces over the on each side of the entry door. Now, this is inside the entry. This is the vestibule, and you can tell that the vestibule has definitely a style to it. This is all very much following in a mold that we're going to see from the book coming up. Now, the director, this woman is fairly flamboyant-looking. L.C.D. Wolf was the new hot decorator from New York City. She had just decorated the Colony Club, and she was an actress. She was a society person, so she was able to be an actress and get away with it. And she liked to dress up, as you can tell, and liked France. She had a little maisonette next to Versailles in France when she would go in the summertime. So she had resources. Now this is interesting. This is her first gig. This is the Colony Club in New York City. Look at the trellis work. Look at the fountain over there. Looks very much like something we know here. Open, out, looking out to the glass on this side, on the other side into the building. So it's got similarities to our own garden place. Talk to me. Sorry.
If the remote is not working, I can...
Okay, I'll just say, please change it. Yeah, it would work. Yeah, I don't know what happened here.
Okay.
I'm sure it's my fault. So, next slide, please. This is looking at our similar kind of a room right here. So we know that well, but it was furnished as it was at the time. Next slide. And the organizing lateral longitudinal hallway, the garden room would have been on the right and the entrance on the left. So this was organizing through the house. So it was very clear sense of circulation. This was coming out of the Beaux-Arts classical principles. Next slide. This shows you the hallway but it broke down into little groupings like we do today. So around that fireplace at the south end, there was this nice tapestry. But notice how there's very little pattern going on in that. You see pattern on the fireplace. And L.C.D. Wolf loved fireplaces. So even though there was central heating, she wanted fireplaces everywhere. She hated floor lamps, so you'll see the sconces everywhere. But the tapestry was your focal point there. But this was defining an area by doing that. Next slide. Okay, this is from a book called 1897 book by Edith Wharton and Ogden Codman. Ogden Codman had worked on doing the bedrooms and things at the breakers that we saw earlier. And they did this book together called The Decoration of Houses. It's basically a textbook for the upper middle class to understand not the details of style so much as the principles of architecture, proportion, scale, and composition, and how to put those together to make you feel comfortable inside of a room. Next slide. And this is another one of their pictures. Again, this one has a fireplace that looks not unlike what we have. And this is from, also, these are the Grand Trianon at Versailles. Next slide. This is Edith Wharton. Next slide. She later was doing fiction. This is before that. And this is the young architect, Ogden Codman, who was working with her on the book. And then I think later they were arguing about who did more work on the book, but if you've ever worked on a project with somebody, you always feel like you did more of the work. Next slide. This is, of course, the wonderful library here. And again, it's a big room. The ceilings are not enormously high. So what they did to manage that is, notice the pressed plaster above. It defines little areas in the room. And the rugs define areas with the furniture, so that it doesn't feel like it's like too big. And this is very carefully done. But the main thing to notice is the carving here. Wonderful relief carving. This is plaster version of it. But in the room, it's actually carved wood in the style of William and Mary from England. And this was done, I think, by local immigrant craftspeople who did the work, but it's very intricate, fabulous. Wood paneling is typical of Northern Europe, not Southern Europe, where you have marble or stone being used more. In France, was kind of in the middle, so you had everything. Next slide. One more slide, please. Okay, so this is just a picture of Hampton Court, which is William and Mary's place. They were trying to kind of step up to be like Louis XIV's Versailles with fancy gardens and everything, but that little, those rooms along there all had woodwork like what we have in that library. Next slide. And this is a close-up of the King's privy dressing room, King William's privy dressing room in that sequence of rooms. And look at how the high relief wood carvings are shown up. Next slide. And so there we have that room again. Next slide. Okay, now we're in the room we're in right now. Notice how the ceiling a little bit breaks up the room, but how the rug creates, when it's just the family here, would have created kind of a conversation area right there in the middle. But then it also lends itself very well to like what we're doing. There could have been a piano here. It could have been people singing, opera singer in for the evening or something for a party. But even though it's a long room, it's divided in the ceiling spaces, and the way these things, this helps break off the room from the farther end of it. So it's nicely spaced to not have it feel like it's too long. It's relative to its height. So proportion is a big part of it. Okay, next slide. And this is the dining room, which was kind of a combination. It's wooden paneling, but painted to look like marble. So you get a little bit of everything. So it's faux marble, and that was very popular. Making things, doing faux painting was a big deal back then. Again, always the sconces, and that's now the admissions office. Next slide. Another slide of that same room, and you can see that there were lots of elaborate tapestries, hangings that were great. Next slide. Now the stairway. This is a good story. This stairway really connects us to where I was talking about Arthur Hoyne and his predecessors and how he got to that. This has a French flair to it with the iron stairway, 18th century flair. But the flying divided stairway is an old type. Next slide. This is 100 years earlier out in Maine, the Ruggles House. I think Portland, but I'm not sure. Ruggles House, and it's Georgian style, much more angular. And we'll be back. But it's a much more angular thing. And it's in a few houses in Lake Forest and Lake Bluff. Benjamin Marshall used that device. And it was used, the one that's most noticeable, and I'm going to show you after this, is the Richard Driehaus Museum. Anybody here been to the Richard Driehaus Museum? Okay, you should all go, because it's the predecessor of this. The architects there in 1883, down in the city, for the Nickersons, they were Burling and Whitehouse. Well, Whitehouse, next slide please. Whitehouse took over after Burling retired, and he hired a young guy named Art Hoyne. And that's where Hoyne was working his way up. And then when Whitehouse retired in 1893, 10 years later, he took over the practice. And this was the big Prairie Avenue practice at the time, which was the most fashionable district on the south side of Chicago, near the lake. And so look at this divided stairway that's in that house, with marble around it and everything. It's a much tighter site. The house is a townhouse, so it couldn't have the things that we have there. But next slide please. Yeah, okay, the stairway goes up and then swoops around on both sides to the balcony up there. So there are lots of pictures on the web of the stairway with brides standing there and everything. It's just a wonderful feature. Next slide. Now we're upstairs in the bedroom area, but this is not from this house. This is from Fontainebleau, again from the book, the 1887 book, The Decoration of Houses, to show the way that these things were supposed to be done proportionally. Next slide. And this is in this house. Notice how upstairs there's more use of pattern in the wallpaper, in the stripes and things that you see. And the carpeting even has more pattern to it than downstairs. Next slide. Here's another one. And notice these beds with the canopies over them, all coming out of this thing that all the elite people had read. And notice the bold stripes on the couch, and the different patterns and the stripes up above the bed. Okay, next slide. This one I really love. This one, they went wild on the patterns here. Look at that rug. It's a great rug, and almost a toile style paper, but anyway, a very detailed paper. And we'll see where these rooms were, but they won't still have these patterns in them now. It's not that, it doesn't still look like that. Next slide. See nice conversation areas. Look at the way they've used chintzy kind of chintz coverings, but the bedspread is very plain. I think this is maybe Grandma's room. Grandma was on the northwest corner. Mrs. Armour's, Lolita Armour's, the mother's house, the bedroom suite was over in that corner of the southwest. The daughter was here in the southeast, and the husband was northeast. So, and what happens on the northwest? The wind comes in the winter and blows. So they put, I think the woman put her mother-in-law on the window. Next slide. So that was her room. It's very nice. It's very nicely detailed. Okay, next slide. Now this is a boudoir. And so these were suites of rooms. Each of these were not just bedrooms. They were suites of rooms with dressing rooms and closets and various auxiliaries. So this is the French idea coming in, and it was also in that Hampton Court room. Like I said, the king's private dressing room was part of a suite of rooms for him. Next slide. And so here's one of these little small rooms with a nice little fireplace, so that you have this sort of intimate settings inside the personal suite. Next slide. And more pattern, lots of pattern. Next slide. Okay, now, looking down from that second story up there to the west, you saw the gardens. And we'll try to do that upstairs. We'll either look out the windows or maybe even go out on maybe one of the balconies and take a peek. And so you looked over, they were meant to be seen from above to some extent. So they had a definite shape. Now my theory, I haven't had anybody tell me this is true. My theory is that those two pools, which are not pools now, the closest one, there's a far pool that was a swimming pool, and that's been filled with water again. But these two pools, I think, were like a coolerator. I think when the west wind came through in the evening, it would have picked up, maybe the water might have helped cool down the air as it came toward the house. Just a thought, just a theory. But you can see the gardens wound through the water. And I know other places in Lake Forest where the water functioned in the summer to be a cooling agent for the people. Next slide. Garden room. Okay, you go out through that to get to the garden room. So you're back on the first floor. Next slide. And here's a plan for the house. You can see it kind of lower left there, and all the gardens that were set up beyond that and winding around with all kinds of trails. And you've been back through there perhaps to see that quite a bit of that hardscape is still there actually. And the wonderful casino at the high point overlooking the lake is still there. Next slide. There you see it, and I think that same, just a different view, same thing, but the plantings will notice these are kind of formal and more Renaissance-y kind of plantings. Next slide. This shows more fluffy plantings. The English garden, which was very popular here, and took on a prairie twist with Jens Jensen, but Gertrude Jekyll was doing that with gardens in England, William Robinson. So all this was there. So some kid with a lot of seeds sometime might want to go out there and just try to plunk a few in. Next slide. Keep going. Next slide. All right. Casino is great and a great viewpoint from up there. And look at how these plantings are raging. These natural plantings are raging up there. Next slide. It's, in fact, I almost have an allergy attack looking at this picture. See this picture? See how that is again? Okay, next slide. But there are little quiet corners. That's a semicircular seat with kind of a wellhead thing there, which is typical European thing that they would pick up on. Make an intimate corner in a big garden. Next slide. There you get more of a sense of these. Very typical looking English gardens interpreted in the Midwest would have looked a lot like that, with those kind of plantings. We don't really see that much of it today, but Camp Rosemary in Lake Forest had a lot of this same kind of feel to it. That was done in the 80s and 90s. Next slide. Oh, and for shade, just like in the south of France or something, they would have things that would break up the lights. In the southwest, they call them ramadas or whatever. But it was a pergola. Next slide. Yep, same thing. Lots of vertical things growing up, vines. Next slide. To blend it in. Now, okay, this slide, this is poor John J. Ogden Armour because he lost all of his money. Between 1919, well, there was a big crash right after World War I. They sent out telegrams from Washington on the 12th of November, 1918, saying, you know all that stuff we ordered? We don't need it now because we made peace. Goodbye. And the business people opened it up and said, what? All that stuff they ordered they're not going to pay for? So they did about 4 different things in Washington to sink the money supply and cause a depression from 1919. And it took a long time to recover. Now, thank goodness we don't have that problem anymore. It never happens now. It takes a long time to recover from a recession. But he lost everything. He thought his father had been a brilliant trader. He thought he could shore up the economy by just buying commodities. And he spent $1 million a day for 250 days. And he took his cousins and everybody all the Armour holdings went into this pool. And he sold them all down the river. It just ended in a fortune. They had to leave this house in 1923, and it really wasn't occupied again until the Academy came along in 1948. So, but next slide, the story goes on. They tried to turn this into a country club, and they actually built a locker room for a fly-in country club for golf in 1928-29. But of course, 1929, there was another interruption in the flow of the economy, and the big crash, and so that never came to fruition. Next slide. Now, Mrs. Armour, a family retainer, was going through one of J. Ogden Armour's desks after he died. He had a lap drawer full of just old little penny stock certificates, and the guy was checking them all. He didn't have the internet, but he was checking to see if any of them were any good. One of them was major holdings of Universal Oil Products. Universal Oil Products was the owner of the patent for ethyl gasoline premium. So all of a sudden, when everybody else in Lake Forest and Chicago had lost their shirt, almost everybody, or was living in very straitened circumstances, the Armours were back in style. Their purchasing power was 100% back from 1923 by 1930-31, and there was a big Fortune magazine article about this. Mrs. Armour built a new house right across from the Enwencia Club. Anybody know where the Enwencia Club is in Lake Forest? Right across the street, saying, I'm back. You know? And it has a lot of features similar. She hired the best decorator at that time, Frances Elkins, who worked with her brother, David Adler. It had a lateral hall, just like the first floor here. It had a winter garden, but it was done by Siri Mong in a new modern kind of Art Deco style. Upstairs was it was a little bit smaller, but not a lot smaller. So she was back. Next slide. Now, the Academy came along, took the locker room that had been built to be, and some of the things that had been built, and adaptively reused them. Here's the chapel, what I think was the locker room. Next slide. This is the architect, Bertram Weber, who'd been an associate of Howard Van Doren Shaw, a local architect. And his father had been a draftsman that worked on the Museum of Science and Industry for the 1893 World's Fair. Next slide. And he built a gym also for the place. That's the gym building. Next slide. And some dorms. Now this dorm is gone now, and it looks kind of odd to us now, but it was what modernism felt like, I think, in 1948, 50, 52, a little bit. Very simple and sparse. Next slide. But the students were now here. So they were reading in this library right over here and having a great time and learning with all this surrounding them. Next slide. This is a novelist, Ward Just. In 2011, he published a book called Rodin's Debutante. And a lot of it takes place at a place called Ogden Hall. He sat here in these rooms in 1948, 49, and instead of when he was supposed to be working on his geometry or whatever, he was thinking in his head, and he's written about this, he was thinking in his head about F. Scott Fitzgerald and all the kind of flappers and Gatsby-esque existence this would have been. Next slide. Shows us F. Scott Fitzgerald, who came to visit in 1915 or so, Ginevra King. Her house was just a little bit east of here, another big country place. Her father was a banker. And Fitzgerald was told that poor boys don't marry rich girls. And she wrote a story that's been published in about 2005 in a book. It's a little kernel of all of his basic plots forever, but she wrote the story, not him. So we have to give credit to her for helping him think up of the sort of longing, yearning for things that you can't have. It's in that story that she wrote. Next slide. Now, we come to Corbin Hall. Styles changed. We saw modernism creeping up on things. By 1967, when they started working on this building, by the mid-60s they were thinking about it. 1969 it opened. They took one of the best architects in Chicago, the firm of Skidmore, Owings and Merrill. Walter Netsch designed this building, and you can see what the function of this building was: to block the view of Reid Hall when we came up to the school. So students arriving would get the impression that this was a really modern school, and none of that old-fashioned stuff. It was out of style. You know how styles come and go. And in the 60s, kids didn't want to go to someplace old-looking. They wanted to go to something that looked brand new. So this was a huge hit and served that function. The library was up, I think, in there so they could be found. Next slide. So here, you went through, and then you could walk up to the main building. And so by a couple decades later, people's tastes had changed again, flip-flop back. And people liked the old buildings in the postmodern period, and a lot of interest in reviving all that. Next slide. So those are the roots of the modern campus that we have. And here you can see all the main building over on the left, and all the work that's been done, the Corbin down below, and the main house up above, and then leading on axis right over to the pond. But all the construction that's been done, very nicely done. The new Ferry Hall building is up there at number 15. Cressy, number 8. The Renaissance, literally, of Lake Forest Academy has come out of that, and very nice design, cued off of what the building is that we are in right this minute. So, thank you very much for your patience, and we'll have a little walking around, if that's okay. And then you can see what some of these things look like, if that's good. Any questions before we do that? Any rebuttals? Well, here's a question. Okay.
Well, I do have a rebuttal, but I'm going to leave that for another time. Having been here to see some of that.
Yeah.
But the question I have is you referred to the purchase of this property in 47, 48. I'm actually curious about a little bit the details. I've heard that it was a group of benefactors who bought it and gave it to the academy. Yeah. Do you know the details?
No, I don't, but I mean, yes, that would make sense.
Does that sound,
yes.
Or you just
the
don't
income
know?
tax in 1947 was 91%, the maximum rate. People would have been going around all over trying to figure out ways to squirrel away and get tax deductions and everything. So I think that's very likely.
Thank you.
Purchased it and given it to the school. A lot of people wanted to see this saved. They didn't want us to see just demoed, So I think there was a strong community feeling that was a good thing to have the academy come in. Rebuttal, right?
No, I noticed that this is something that's always confused me. I noticed there Melody spelled with one L. And
yes.
yet we see all around it
yes.
spelled with one L and two L's.
So
I'm assuming
Mrs. Armour, Mrs. Jagged Armour, decided it looked better with two L's. Well,
so that's why we see it both ways.
Right. And there's actually a street over here that's Melody with one L in one part, and you go to the other part and it's Melody with two L's.
Exactly.
And those people are really in trouble. They never know. But yes, as I understand it, she chose that name. And I think, that didn't cost anything.
And that new development that's going up on Milwaukee and 60, that's with two L's, right? They're calling it.
Yeah.
Is it one or two?
It's two L's.
Two, yeah. So so are they just stealing the name from this area to...
Yeah, you could have a moment of her with them and talk about
Melody Farm. There was a Melody Farms back in the 40s and 50s.
The spread clear out there. Yeah. He bought the property.
Same family?
The Cuneo family
It's
bought
Cuneo. I thought Cuneo.
Cuneo bought it.
Right.
Okay.
He was publishing magazines that people read in the 30s and had cash when nobody else had cash and just bought it.
Okay. So there's multiple Melody Farms. Okay.
Yeah, well, it was all one swooping big thing, but it changed hands from here. It wasn't owned here anymore. It was on the other side of the road. Now, the thing I forgot I gave them my slideshow yesterday, and after that I remembered that I didn't show Ferry Hall, and that architect was important. Cobb and Frost were the main architects for the 1888 uptick on that place. And you can't see the pictures here, but I'll leave the book over there somewhere you can see it. But it was basically Henry Ives Cobb's audition to do the University of Chicago campus starting in 1890. The buildings at the University of Chicago look suspiciously like the Ferry Hall buildings of 1888. So it's an interesting little wrinkle. And they actually had a college called Ferry College over there for several years in that period also. People were more comfortable having their daughters go to a single-gender school. I don't know why, but they did. No rebuttals? I thought so. So my own take on the building over there, the Corbin building, is that they're interesting. They're in conversation with each other now. It's two different eras, but they go back. It just reminds. So students here that are here every day, they'll see that there are, in different periods, people have different ways of expressing themselves. Modernism is now back. We're in the modernist revival, I guess you call it, or the international style revival. And some people would probably like to have that not there, but you can also make a case for leaving it there because it's the history of the institution and it shows students. And my final point about this all is that your students being in these buildings, so well done, so well planned, so well detailed, it's an education in proportion, composition, and scale. And hopefully when they go out and commit architecture with their wives in the future or husbands, they will have picked up enough information about this from just being in here. They'll know what's right. When somebody shows them a rendering or a plan, they'll be able to read that and say, well, I can't exactly tell you why, but it doesn't feel right. Because they will have been in a place where everything was right. Thank you.